Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, at 73, still carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms with grace. Her silver hair was always neatly pinned back, and despite the arthritis that made her fingers stiff in the mornings, she took pride in her appearance. Standing barely 5 feet tall, she had the kind of presence that commanded respect, or at least it used to. For 47 years, Margaret had been the backbone of the Whitmore family. As a young woman, she'd abandoned her dreams of becoming a teacher to marry Robert Whitmore and raise their son, David. When Robert passed away 15 years ago, she'd poured her life savings into helping David start his construction business, mortgaging her paid-off home to give him the capital he needed. She'd been the one to babysit her grandchildren, Emma and Jake, every day after school, while David and his wife Sarah worked. She'd cooked Sunday dinners for the family every week, sewn Halloween costumes, and never missed a birthday or school play. Margaret had been the family's anchor, the one who held everyone together through divorces, job losses, and heartbreaks. She'd given up her own social life, her own dreams, her own comfort, all for the people she loved most. Her modest 2-story home had become the family gathering place where holidays were celebrated and milestones marked. She'd been patient. When David moved his family into her house during his business's rocky start, understanding when they stayed longer than planned, and generous when they never offered to help with expenses. But somewhere along the way, her family had begun to see her sacrifices not as love but as obligation. Her son David, now 45 and successful in his construction business, had grown impatient with what he called her old-fashioned ways. His wife Sarah, 38 and always dressed in the latest fashions, had begun making subtle comments about Margaret's cooking, her decorating, her opinions. The grandchildren, Emma, 16, and Jake, 14, had started treating her like an embarrassing relic, rolling their eyes when she spoke, and avoiding her attempts at conversation. The shift had been gradual, so subtle that Margaret hadn't fully realized it until the day they told her she was embarrassing them. The words still echoed in her mind, sharp as broken glass. "Mom, you're embarrassing us." But what came next would change everything, and show them exactly what embarrassment really looked like. Margaret's relationship with her family hadn't always been strained. She remembered the early days when David was small, how he'd run to her with skinned knees and broken toys, trusting her to make everything better. She'd been the room mother for his class parties, the one who drove him to Little League practice, the one who sat up all night when he had the flu. When he graduated high school, she'd worked 2 jobs to help pay for his college tuition, even though it meant eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner most nights. After David married Sarah, Margaret had welcomed her daughter-in-law with open arms. She'd spent weeks helping plan their wedding, contributing money she couldn't really afford for the reception. When Sarah was pregnant with Emma, Margaret had been there for every appointment, every midnight craving, every moment of panic. She'd painted the nursery, assembled the crib, and spent the first month after Emma's birth sleeping on their couch to help with night feedings. The pattern had continued with Jake's birth, and through every challenge that followed. When David's business hit hard times during the recession, Margaret had not only opened her doors to her son's family, but had also taken out a second mortgage on her home to keep his company afloat. She'd never asked for repayment, never demanded gratitude. She'd simply loved them, supported them, and believed that family meant everything. But as the years passed and David's business flourished, something had shifted. The family meals became less frequent, the phone calls shorter. Margaret found herself making excuses for their behavior, telling herself they were just busy, just stressed. She'd continued to be available whenever they needed her, babysitting when they wanted date nights, cooking when Sarah was too tired, lending money when unexpected expenses arose. The grandchildren, once so eager to spend time with their grandmother, had gradually pulled away. Emma had stopped asking Margaret to help with school projects, preferring to struggle alone rather than accept help from someone who didn't understand modern technology. Jake had quit coming to her for homework help, claiming her methods were too old school. Their eyes had grown distant when she'd tried to share stories of her own childhood, their responses becoming monosyllabic. Margaret had watched her family grow away from her, but she'd convinced herself it was natural, that children grew up and got busy with their own lives. She'd made excuses for their behavior, blamed herself for being too needy, too old-fashioned, too much. But deep down, she'd felt the sting of their rejection, the pain of being taken for granted by the people she'd given everything to. The charity gala at the Riverside Country Club was supposed to be a celebration. Margaret had been volunteering for the Children's Hospital Foundation for over 20 years, and this year, she was being honored as Volunteer of the Year. She'd been so proud when David agreed to attend with his family, thinking it would be wonderful to have them there for such an important moment in her life. Margaret had worn her best dress, a navy blue creation she'd bought for David's wedding 15 years ago. It was a bit dated, perhaps, but it was elegant and made her feel special. She'd styled her silver hair carefully and worn the pearl necklace Robert had given her for their 20th anniversary. She'd felt beautiful, dignified, and excited to share this honor with her family. The evening had started well enough. Margaret had introduced David, Sarah, and the grandchildren to the other volunteers, beaming with pride as she spoke about her son's successful business and her accomplished grandchildren. But as the evening progressed, she began to notice the subtle signs of their discomfort. Sarah kept checking her phone, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for someone more interesting to talk to. The grandchildren stood slouched beside their parents, Emma texting continuously while Jake played games on his phone. David's smile seemed forced, his responses to other guests polite but distant. The breaking point came when Margaret was called to the stage to receive her award. As she stood to make her way to the front of the room, she tripped slightly on the hem of her dress. It was a minor stumble, barely noticeable, but it caused her to bump into the table behind her, rattling the glasses. "Oh my God, this is so embarrassing," Emma whispered, not quite quietly enough. Margaret's face flushed, but she continued to the stage, where she accepted her award with grace and gave a heartfelt speech about the importance of giving back to the community. When she returned to the table, she expected to see pride in her family's faces. Instead, she found them looking anywhere but at her. "Mom," David said quietly as she sat down, "you're embarrassing us. That stumble and then that speech. It was way too long. People are staring." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And that dress is so outdated. I told you I'd take you shopping for something more appropriate." "Grandma, everyone's looking at us," Jake added, his voice filled with teenage mortification. Emma didn't even look up from her phone. "Can we just go? This is social suicide." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Here she was, being honored for decades of service to her community, and her own family was ashamed of her. The people she'd sacrificed everything for, the people she'd loved unconditionally, were treating her like a burden, like an embarrassment. While the locksmith began changing the locks on all exterior doors, Margaret and Patricia methodically packed David and Jessica's belongings. Everything was boxed neatly and professionally. Margaret's teaching background had made her naturally organized, and she approached this task the same way she'd once prepared classroom materials. The scene was remarkably calm and orderly. Margaret had learned long ago that the most effective discipline was delivered without emotion, with clear consequences that spoke louder than angry words. Each item that went into the boxes was a reminder of how David and Jessica had taken her generosity for granted while treating her with increasing disrespect. At 4:30 p.m., just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, David's car pulled into the driveway. Margaret watched from her living room window as her son and daughter-in-law approached the front door, their faces showing confusion when David's key wouldn't work in the lock. Margaret opened the door before they could knock, her expression serene and composed. "Hello, David. Jessica. Your belongings are on the front lawn. boxed and ready for transport. The shock on their faces was immediate and complete. Jessica's mouth fell open, while David stammered, "Mom, what is this? What's going on?" "This," Margaret said calmly, "is the consequence of calling someone trash in their own home while living off their generosity. You have 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements, as specified in the legal eviction notice you'll find taped to the top box." Jessica's shock quickly transformed into fury. "You can't do this. This is insane. David, tell your mother she can't throw us out." "Actually," Margaret replied, her principal's voice returning in full force, "I absolutely can. This is my house, which I own free and clear. You've been living here as guests, and guests who insult their host forfeit their welcome." David finally found his voice, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Mom, you're being completely unreasonable. Jessica didn't mean what she said. You can't expect us to find a place in 30 days. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the grateful child she'd raised, but a man who had become comfortable taking advantage of others. "David, I gave you life, raised you alone after your father died, sacrificed my own dreams to fund your education and career, and opened my home to you when you claimed to need help. In return, your wife called me trash, and you sat silent. That tells me everything I need to know about the man you've become." The neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual scene of boxes on Margaret's typically pristine lawn. Margaret was acutely aware of the audience, but she felt no embarrassment, only the satisfaction of finally standing up for herself after years of being diminished in her own home. "Mrs. Williams," Jessica's voice took on a pleading tone as the reality of their situation began to sink in. "Please, we can work this out. I was having a bad morning when I said those things. I didn't mean it." Margaret's smile was gentle but implacable. "Jessica, dear, I spent 35 years teaching teenagers, and I learned to tell the difference between genuine remorse and panic at facing consequences. You meant every word you said, just as I mean every word I'm saying now. You called me trash on Tuesday. Today is Thursday. Trash day. How perfectly appropriate." The following weeks brought a parade of desperate phone calls, pleading text messages, and awkward encounters that only reinforced Margaret's conviction that she had made the right decision. David and Jessica had initially found temporary shelter with Jessica's parents, an arrangement that lasted exactly 5 days before Jessica's mother called Margaret personally. "Margaret, I need to apologize for my daughter's behavior. Linda." Morrison's voice was tight with embarrassment over the phone. "I had no idea how she'd been treating you. After 3 days of listening to her complain about everything from our guest towels to our coffee, I'm beginning to understand what you've been dealing with." The conversation revealed much about Jessica's character that Margaret had suspected, but never confirmed. Linda explained how Jessica had always been demanding and entitled, expecting others to cater to her needs while contributing little in return. "She's 32 years old, Margaret, and this is the first time she's ever had to face real consequences for her behavior. Maybe this is exactly what she needs." David's attempts at reconciliation were perhaps even more painful to witness than Jessica's tantrums. He showed up at Margaret's door on a Saturday morning, looking haggard and desperate. Margaret invited him in for coffee, hoping against hope that her son might finally understand the magnitude of what had transpired. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything that happened," David began, sitting at the kitchen table where she'd served him thousands of meals over the years. "I know Jessica can be difficult sometimes, but family is supposed to forgive each other, right? Can't we just put this behind us?" Margaret studied her son's face, searching for any sign of genuine understanding or remorse. What she saw instead was calculation, the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when trying to talk his way out of punishment after breaking curfew. "David," she said quietly, "tell me what you think Jessica did wrong." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, she shouldn't have called you what she called you. That was harsh. And what else?" I'm not sure what you mean." "What about the 2 years of living in my home without paying rent or utilities? What about the expensive meals I prepared that were criticized and taken for granted? What about the credit cards I provided that funded your lifestyle while my savings dwindled? What about your silence when your wife repeatedly disrespected me in my own home?" David's face reddened. "Mom, we never asked you to do those things. You offered." The response hit Margaret like a revelation. This wasn't about Jessica's one cruel comment. It was about years of entitlement and exploitation that had been masked as family obligation. Her son genuinely believed that her generosity had been freely given without expectation of basic respect or gratitude. "You're absolutely right, David," Margaret said, her voice deadly calm. "I did offer all those things, just as I'm now offering you the opportunity to learn how to stand on your own feet like the adult man I raised you to be." David's expression hardened. "Fine, if that's how you want it to be. But don't expect me to come crawling back when you change your mind. And don't expect us to take care of you when you're too old to manage on your own." Margaret smiled sadly. "Son, I've been taking care of myself just fine for 72 years. The question you should be asking is who's going to take care of you now that your safety net is gone." As David stormed out, slamming the door behind him, Margaret felt a complex mixture of grief and relief. She mourned the relationship they'd lost, but she refused to accept responsibility for its destruction. That burden belonged to the man who had allowed his wife to call his mother trash and had seen nothing wrong with the sentiment. The legal eviction proceeded without further incident. Margaret's lawyer reported that David and Jessica had found a small apartment across town, their lifestyle considerably scaled back from the comfortable arrangement they'd enjoyed in Margaret's spacious home. The expensive dinners, designer clothes, and casual spending sprees were no longer possible on their salaries alone. Through mutual friends, Margaret learned that the couple was struggling with the reality of independent adult life. Jessica had been forced to take a second job to help make ends meet, while David discovered that his business wasn't as self-sustaining as he'd believed. Many of his clients had come through Margaret's connections and referrals, resources that were no longer available to him. Margaret felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but she felt no guilt either. They were simply experiencing the natural consequences of their choices, the same lessons she'd tried to teach countless students over the years. Actions have consequences. Respect must be earned and maintained, and gratitude is not optional in healthy relationships. 6 months after Trash Day, Margaret's life had transformed in ways she never could have anticipated. The house that had felt like a prison of unappreciated service now breathed with new life and purpose. She'd redecorated David's old room into a proper home office, complete with a comfortable reading chair, and shelves lined with the books she'd never had time to enjoy during her working years. Margaret had also discovered something remarkable. She was not the lonely, unwanted old woman that Jessica's words had tried to make her believe. Once word spread through her network of former colleagues and friends about what had happened, Margaret found herself the center of a supportive community she hadn't realized existed. Eleanor, her real estate agent friend, had introduced her to a book club filled with retired professionals who gathered weekly to discuss literature and current events. Margaret's sharp mind and years of educational experience made her a valued member of the group, and she found herself looking forward to their Thursday evening meetings with anticipation she hadn't felt in years. But Margaret had found something she hadn't expected in her new life: peace. In her senior community, she was surrounded by people who had lived full lives, who had stories to tell and wisdom to share. She was respected for her experience, valued for her contributions, and appreciated for her presence. She had no regrets. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the community center of Sunset Gardens Senior Living, accepting another volunteer award, this one for organizing the facility's first ever intergenerational reading program. The room was filled with residents, their adult children, and the local elementary school students who participated in the program. The applause was warm and genuine, and Margaret felt the kind of pride that comes from being truly valued. Her den apartment at Sunset Gardens was small, but perfectly suited to her needs. She decorated it with her favorite furniture from the house, the pieces that held the best memories. The community was vibrant and active, with book clubs, game nights, and volunteer opportunities. For the first time in years, Margaret had friends her own age who shared her interests and appreciated her company. She'd remained firm in her decision, despite continued pleas from her family. David had visited once, bringing divorce papers that he blamed on the stress of their situation. Margaret had listened with genuine sadness, but hadn't wavered in her choice. She'd offered to help him find a therapist, but she wouldn't rescind her decision. Emma had graduated high school and was working full-time, having given up her college dreams when the trust fund was redirected. She'd written Margaret several letters, each one more mature and thoughtful than the last. Margaret had responded to each one, maintaining their relationship while holding firm to her boundaries. Jake had struggled the most with the transition, his grades suffering as the family dealt with their new reality. But he'd also learned skills he never would have developed in his grandmother's house: cooking, cleaning, budgeting, and the value of hard work. As Margaret looked out at the audience in the community center, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. These people saw her as she truly was, not just a convenient source of support, but a woman with wisdom, experience, and value. They didn't see her age as an embarrassment, but as something to be respected. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, apologizing for her existence, making herself smaller to accommodate others' comfort. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that dignity wasn't something you could give away and expect to receive back. Margaret had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to stop enabling someone else's selfish behavior. She'd learned that respect isn't automatic. It's earned and maintained through actions, not words. And she'd learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, to demand the treatment you deserve, to refuse to be anyone's embarrassment. The lesson her family had learned was harder, but perhaps more valuable. That taking someone for granted is a luxury that can be revoked without warning. That the people who love you most are often the ones who deserve your best behavior, not your worst. And that some actions, once taken, can change a relationship forever. As Margaret accepted her award and looked out at the faces of people who truly appreciated her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the joy of being exactly who she was, without apology or accommodation. She was no longer embarrassed to be herself, and that, she thought, was the most empowering feeling in the world. In the end, Margaret discovered that the most important person to impress was herself. She'd spent decades trying to earn love through sacrifice, only to learn that real love, including self-love, requires respect, boundaries, and the courage to demand better. Her family's embarrassment had been their loss, not hers. And while the price of self-respect had been high, it had been worth every penny.